Hello and welcome to the Andy Hodges Report. I'm your host, Andy Hodges. Constitutional Amendment Bill number 3. That is the raging discussion and debate here in Zimbabwe. Today, I'm going to pose questions. I have my views, of course, about certain issues that are in the Constitutional Amendment Bill, and I'll mention those. But most of the things I will be talking about today will be about asking questions. First, let me start with what I thought was a fact. I thought it was a fact that a constitution of any country would be hard to vote for and hard to change. What do I mean hard to vote for and hard to change? If you look at our current constitution, that went to a referendum in 2013 and it passed overwhelmingly. That was hard to change because we had to go out and speak to every citizen in Zimbabwe and ask them to vote for it. What about hard to actually change or adapt? Well, that was why I believe there were certain clauses in the Constitution that would limit the ability for any individual or any body to change the Constitution at any time. Now, why do I say this? Well, the first part of the bill, which was gazetted at the beginning of February 2026, is very clear. And I need to read this to you, and then I need to ask a question. It says, whereas Section 88 and 117 of the Constitution provides that the executive authority derives from the people of Zimbabwe and must be exercised in accordance with the Constitution. Then it says, legislative authority of Zimbabwe is derived from the people and is vested in an exercise in accordance with the Constitution by the legislator. And this is where it becomes interesting, because this is the powers now that this bill believes the legislator has. It says, legislative authority is allowed to amend the Constitution in accordance with Section 328. They make laws for peace and order and good governance in Zimbabwe and to confer subordinate legislative powers upon another body of authority. Okay, that's fine. Let's be clear. There's no issue about changing a constitution of a country. There's nothing wrong with that at all, and it happens all the time. Okay. Secondly, let's also be clear that any political party, whoever they may be, may put forward what they believe are amendments to the Constitution. There's no problem with that at all. Okay. Let me go back to what I said right at the beginning. I said that a constitution should be hard changed. Why do I say that? Well, because if you read that first opening part of the bill, which effectively states that because the people voted for the legislator in the last elections, okay, that gives them the right to change the Constitution. That's what it says. Okay, right? So here's my question. When we went for elections, the last elections, I believe we were signing a contract. We were signing a contract between the voter and the person we were voting for. That contract was for 5 years. And the agreement was in 5 years' time, they would come back and be able to ask us to vote for them again based on their performance. That's very simple. It's a contract. Okay, right. Now, how are the legislator able to, just by having a 2/3 majority, be able to change the Constitution, and more importantly, cancel the next elections in 2028 and extend it to 2030, but by doing so, extend their own terms? So that sounds to me and to many, it sounds very self-serving, because surely if you're voting to extend your own term, okay, somehow that doesn't make sense, particularly when you put it around the concept that you came to us and chose to ask us for 5 years. And that's what we voted for. So I need to ask that question. How is it possible for people to vote on something or on a bill which serves their own interests by extending their own terms, which they didn't have when they went and asked the electorate to vote for them? So that's my first question about it. Here's my second question about this. A constitution is not meant just for today. It's meant for generations. It's meant for our children, their children, and their children. It's meant for 100, 200 years. Okay, that's what a constitution is. That's why I keep saying it should be hard to change. Okay, because that is how sacrosanct it must be. But we're now in a situation, and this is another question. My question is simple. Do we now have a constitution, or do we just have a bill? Why am I saying this? Well, because if you can change the Constitution at any time when you have a 2/3 majority, okay, that isn't a constitution. That's a bill. That's saying we need so many people to vote for this to get approval. That's a bill. And my concern is, does it set a precedent? What happens in 50 years when somebody wants to change the constitution or become self-serving and can do it through just by going through parliament? That is my concern. Secondly, of course, now again we move on to an issue that most people talk about. Should these changes go to a national referendum, as they did in 2013 when we were looking at voting in this current constitution? That's the crux. Now, I'm not a lawyer, okay, and I'm sure it's going to be played out in courts for many years or many months going forward, and I suppose rightly it should. Reason is this, is because the changes I see that are cut in the bill are fundamental changes to the constitution. Okay. Remember, we're not here talking about people. We're not talking about personalities. We're not talking about political parties. We're not talking anything like that. We're talking about a piece of paper that binds every single one of our citizens together. A piece of paper that we live by. That is what a constitution is. But if you can go to parliament with 2/3 majority and vote at any time to change that constitution, that bedrock of our society, is it a constitution or is it a bill? That's my question. Now, let's get to other issues that some may have found contentious. They talk about the extension of the presidential term limit and the legislators up to 2030. Okay, that's number one. Then they say that the president or the legislator can stand for 2 7-year terms. Okay, right? Let's also be clear. 7 years, it's fine. I have no issue with 7 years. I think 7 years is great. The question I have is, what does it mean to the current people incumbent? Because, of course, we do have a section in the Constitution that states that whatever changes are made cannot have an impact on the people who are currently in office. And so my question is, how is that going to get dealt with? Because it's very clear in the Constitution that you cannot change fundamental issues like that without going to a referendum. Well, so many legal experts say. Again, I'm not a legal expert, so I don't know. And we're going to find out in the courts, but it's just a question. Okay, the next question is this. If for the highest office in the land, if you get to 2030, are you allowed to stand again? Or do you now have an extra 1 7-year term, or do you have 2 more 7-year terms? And that I'm not clear about. So I'd like people to answer that question. That's a question, remember. Okay, so the crux of these issues to me isn't the changes. I have no issue with 7 years. I have no issues with the way of the MPs extending their term to 2030. I have no problem with those at all, okay? The issue I have is the process of that change. Should the process be through Parliament, or should the process be through a referendum? That's the key. And I think I would love that question to be answered. And I have a feeling, I have a really big feeling, it's only going to be answered in court. That is what I truly believe. Now, let's talk about some of the other things that I ponder about. We've got rid of the big thing on the referendum, no referendum. Okay, we've got that there. All right, now, let's talk about one of the clauses which talks about Parliament electing the president. Okay, now, again, I have no problem with that whatsoever. In fact, I would heartily endorse it. Why would I endorse it? Well, simply because, can you imagine a situation when you go for a national election and your party wins the vote, but your presidential candidate loses? I mean, why would that happen? It's completely insane. It makes no sense. Also, look at things like South Africa, even the UK, in a certain way. They don't go and elect their prime minister or their president. They are elected by the members of the parliament, and normally they would be the leader of that party that will become the president. I have no problem with that whatsoever. Here's my question. Why only go halfway? Why not go for complete proportional representation? Why? In Zimbabwe, we have first past the post. If you look at the last elections, ZANU-PF won over just close to 2.8 million votes. The opposition parties in total won around 2.3, 2.4 million. Okay. Now, because of first past the post, a lot of those opposition votes disappeared because the person who won only had to win by 1 vote to win that seat. So if I got 10,001 votes and my opposition, my opponent got 10,000, I would win. If those 10,000 votes go, but I'm sitting in parliament, technically representing all that 20,001 people, but actually only 10,001 voted for me. So if you go to proportional representation, okay, like South Africa has done, where you put a list of candidates down, you get your votes, and then you allocate the seats as per your list. That's going the whole way. That now becomes a true democracy. because it means that the voices that you don't hear, the voices that can't talk because the person won first past the post, are now counted in. Of course, the danger with that is constant coalition governments, which may not be good for the country, but it seems as if some form of proportional representation should start coming in. At least, why not? It just makes a lot of sense. Maybe minority groups starting off and so forth, but at least you could have proportional representation. So let's just go all the way. But that clause, I have no issue with at all. There's also a clause talking about who runs the election. Now, before it was under the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, they were in charge of the voters' roll, etc., the education, all that kind of stuff, yeah? Now that's moving back to the Registrar General, as per the amendment requests. I have no problem with that either. I think the Registrar General is highly equipped for it, as long as, of course, we ensure transparency and the voters' roll is secure and so forth. Why not? Let me think about it. The Registrar General has all our IDs. It has all our information, okay? It knows everything about us, in essence, through the data that they have. So it makes sense if they could put in place a robust electoral roll. Using that, I have no issue with that whatsoever at all. There's also an issue about the president electing 10 more senators. He's allowed to elect 10 more senators on his own. Again, that's something to debatable. Does that mean that the president or the person in that office will be electing more senators to be able to vote for him in an election when they come for an election? That's a bit unclear, so I'm not really sure about that. Okay. The other issue, of course, which is also contentious, is the judiciary or the appointments of the Supreme Court and so forth. Okay, that's also contentious. Well, why? Well, because a lot of people believe there should be a separation between the state, between the executive, the executive, the presidential executive, the parliament, and of course the judiciary. There should be a separate independence of that. The issue comes, though, is that if the president is the one that directly chooses or appoints the judges on the advice of the Judicial Service Commission, of course, yeah, then is that seen as if the executive controls the judges? I think that is down to, for me, it's down to transparent vetting, transparent interviews. I think in some countries they even do public interviews of some of these Supreme Court justices, like they do in America, for example, in South Africa, just so that people can see that this is the person that is being put forward for these roles. Things like that can happen. So I'm not too concerned by that, as long as, of course, we maintain that transparency and trust. There is one clause that a lot of people haven't spoken about. It's a clause to do with the defense forces. They amend, I think, 3 words. It says upholding this constitution, or stay true to the values of the constitution. Now, I like that clause. Why? Because it takes away the impact of the military saying, we want to have a coup because we're defending the constitution. Okay, now that's not in the constitution. They cannot do that. What they can do is support what's happening underneath the constitution, so to speak. So I think that's a good clause as well. Look, there's so many other different clauses that we could go through, but in essence, those are the main ones. In other words, we're talking about changing a constitution without going to a referendum. That's the proposal. My question is why? Bearing in mind all the things I've said, we're talking about changing the terms of the members of parliament, the Senate, and the president to 2 7-year terms, and basically eliminating our next election in 2028, basically out of it, done, no more election, and the next election will be in 2030. Okay, that's the main clause. Again, was that subject to a referendum? Okay, these are what I would consider fundamental changes. Now, I wish someone could explain to me why they aren't, but I think the crux of the matter is this: a lot of the clauses I have no issue with whatsoever. I really don't. And I think a lot of Zimbabweans don't have an issue with a lot of the clauses. I think the issue comes in is that should this go to a referendum or not? And I think that's the critical question. And that's the question that, as I said, it's gonna work its way out through court. It ain't gonna be happening. I'm not gonna tell you what's gonna happen because I have no clue. I'm not a lawyer. I have no problem with some of these things. And I want to close this by saying something fundamental, which I started by saying in the beginning. Constitution should be hard to change. It's very important that you understand that. It should be, because we're not talking about people. We're not talking about political parties. We're not talking about individuals. And I would like everybody to just take that out of their minds. This is not about incumbent people or what's happening. No, it isn't. This is about a piece of paper that should stand the test of time. That we should be able to be saying in 100 years' time, this constitution has not changed. This is our constitution and we love it. That is what we should say. And I think it's important that whatever is done in this constitutional debate, whatever way we go forward, because by the way, it's already passed. It doesn't matter what you're going to say, it's passed the National Assembly, it's passed the Senate. Why? Because the ruling party has the vote. So it's a done deal. Let's be clear about this. It's passed. Now becomes the legal battle to understand the process. But this document is for our future. This document is for 100, 200 years in the future. So it's important, I think, that we all get a say. I'm Andy Hodges. This is the Andy Hodges Report. Goodbye, and please, you all be safe.